Hello everybody, welcome to another Python tutorial. This one will focus on Google Trends, more specifically how we can extract data from it, how we can analyze it, as well as make conclusions. Now, one question that you might have is, what's wrong with using just the Google Trends website? The answer to that is absolutely nothing's wrong. You can do it, so let's give it a try. If we use a fidget spinner, it would work. We can analyze the data, but if we want to do the same for 100 keywords, it would take us a lot more time. And this is one thing that we can do faster and more efficient with Python on one side, but analyzing interest over time, for example, is more than just entering the keyword. You need to spend time to analyze the data that is shown, and oftentimes you will need to change the time frame. And what I mean by that is the following. What we see on the screen is the interest over time for the last 12 months for fidget spinner, right? And the conclusion that you will make is, oh, this is a product that seems quite stable, maybe a slight decline. But if you take a look at the last 5 years, that conclusion is completely changed, right? As you can see, it was very popular at one point in time. So I would say end of April, beginning of May 2017. And then the interest faded away and it's at very low point now. So this would be a completely different conclusion that you would make. So if you want to do the analysis keyword by keyword, so one by one, you have to, first of all, have the search term inserted. You would need to adjust. So for example, maybe you're interested in the worldwide interest. You'd have to adjust the time frame. Often the category as well, not always maybe, but often, and you would like to adjust it if, for example, your search term can be a book, a movie, a song, and all of those things, and you're only interested in one of them, or maybe there's something that falls under many categories and you just want to focus on one. So we're not going to do this in this tutorial, but I'll show you how it can be done. And lastly is the web search. That's the default, but you can also search the interest over time for a particular keyword in image search, news search, Google Shopping, or YouTube search. So all of these things can be done with Python, and we're going to see how that is done. But the last part is that we will cover in this series, maybe not in this video, but for sure in this series. If you scroll to the end, what you will find is this related queries. This is basically what people have been searching for when it comes to fidget spinner. And if you remember, we've adjusted the time frame to 5 years, but you might question how relevant is this today, because this is what people have searched in the last 5 years. So maybe it's no longer relevant today. Now, if you want to get a better guess on what people are searching for today, you might want to choose a shorter time frame. So maybe the last 90 days, last 30 days, or even maybe last 7 days. The past hour, 4 hours, or day time frame I would use only for keywords that have really a lot of data, but oftentimes that's not the case. So I think good estimate would be last 30 days for that. Now, how would you use Python? That on the left side I have the script. Well, I'm going to delete all the code and start from scratch so you can see how it's being done. But I want to show you what the output would look like at the end. So let's select fidget spinner as our keyword. We will have only one. And let's take a look at the outcome of the script. Now, the average 5 years interest spinner was at 424. We'll see what this means during this tutorial. The last year interest compared to the last 5 years has changed by minus 91.75%. So it's really low compared to the last 5 years. And based on this line chart, we can see that that is indeed the case. Then the interest is declining and not comparable to its peak, something that we can also see, and it is completely new because it didn't exist at the beginning of this period. So 5 years ago, as you can see, it is 0. So maybe here we can say it did not exist 5 years ago, as opposed to it is completely new. So it's really up to you to decide what the outcome would be of the analysis. But we will see how step by step to get to this point and what does this mean. So I'm going to remove, as I mentioned, the code, and I would use pytrends. This is a library that is very well created, and it would allow us to basically do all the things that we would otherwise do on the Google Trends website, except we can do it with Python, which would make it much faster. And this is something that we can automate. If this is, of course, something that we do at our job, then why do it all over again instead of just clicking one button and then Python would provide us with the analysis. So we're going to start with getting the data and going through the library and seeing what do we need to adjust and how we can do it to make sure that we have a good conclusion at the end. So if we have 100 keywords to analyze, we already know that it would be much faster than otherwise. So first, if you have not installed, please stop the video, use Pip Install Pythons to make sure that you have the library. And if you scroll a bit below, you will see that it requires requests, LHML, and pandas. I'm not sure if all of these would be required in this particular video, but maybe later on. So if you get an error arising due to any of these, then use pip install to install them as well. Now, the first step is we need to connect what we have to Google. So whatever we're using, in this case, it's Python, and this library is particular for Python. So we need to make this connection with Google Trends. So from pytrends.request, we're going to import trend rec. So trend, capital T, and rec, capital R. And pytrends would be equal to this trend rec, which we just imported. HL stands for host language, and TZ stands for time zone. Now this one I'm going to remove, because if we're analyzing a period of 5 years, the time zone is not really relevant. So I'm going to just remove that. And now if we continue through the library, we will see that this is the part build payload, which is the key point of, let's say, adding all the important parameters to our search. So we have a keywords list. In this case, as an example, it's mentioned blockchain, and then this is the part that we need to have at the beginning of our code that takes the list. And as you see, even if it's just one keyword, it is still stored as a list. The category, so we saw that already here, right? Then we have the time frame, which is something that we also saw. Geo stands for the region, so is it worldwide or country related or maybe state related, and gprop, and we'll see that this one is related to the last one. So these 5 different inputs from our side would be stored in 5 different arguments. So let's start with this. I'm going to copy this and I'll do the following. Let's have a separate line for all of these. I think this is good. Now, I prefer to have all the changes that we're going to make later on in the code at the beginning. So, for example, keyword list. Let's have this as all keywords instead. Again, it would be a list. So I think so far we only checked fidget spinner. So let's add that one for now at least. And here it would be the list that we would want to get the keywords from to analyze the Google Trends. Category is equal to 0. Now see, this is the default, meaning all categories. If you want to change for, maybe you're interested in books and literature, if you select that, at the top you will see that the category is now equal to 22. So if that is the case, you would set this category, let me add it to the top, maybe after the keywords, it would be equal to 22. Now keep in mind that this has to be string. You should not include it as an integer. It has to be string. So the default basically would be 0. And here we no longer have to specify that, so we already know what that is. Next we have time frame. If we scroll down, you'll see this part of the library, which is very well written. It's the common parameters that we're going to use. So the keyword list, it's quite clear. Here it's mentioned that there is up to 5 terms in the list. This is partly true. So in terms of let's say that there's a workaround on this. Because basically, if you add here let's say food, which has a lot more interest to fidget spinner, and you'll see how that compares, right? So you can add one more, maybe cycling, and you can add one more, and in this case there's a limit of 5. Now personally, I would not advise you to choose 5 keywords unless you want to see the relative interest between the two. So if you want to see how food compares to cycling, sure, do it. This is fine. This is the right way to do it. But if you're interested, if there's trend based on Google Trends on a particular keyword, always use the keyword as a standalone keyword. And this is why. What you will notice is that regardless of the search term that you use, regardless of the time frame, and on actually any of this selection that you've done, there will always be at least one point where the interest was highest. So as you can see, for a fidget spinner, it was, say, mid-May 2017. And then, yeah, everything else, all these other points are related to that peak. So we don't know, was the interest high or how high the interest was. We also only know when was the peak and how are these other points in time related to that peak. So if the peak at 100 was 100,000 searches, then this one at 20 is 20,000 searches. So it's all relative measurement. Now, if you select, if you take a look at the last year, right, it's all 1 or below 1, sure. But if your selection is for the last 12 months, you again have a point where it has been the highest, and then everything else is related to that point. So just keep that in mind. Now, the reason why I said if you're interested in the trends, always use the standalone keyword, not include other keywords, is the following. If you check the last 5 years, and if you suddenly add some keyword that has a different, or let's say a higher interest, and I've mentioned food already, you'll see that this peak that was before 100, see now it's probably around 30, so 26, 28. Now, it's more difficult to make a conclusion based on this, because everything's scaled to the highest interest, and that was probably for food. I can imagine it was somewhere at this point here, so beginning of August 2020. So the answer to this part, is there a limit? Yes, there's a limit if you're comparing 5 at the same time, but if you're comparing them one by one, there's absolutely no limit from this point of view. So we're going to do that. And basically the way we're going to do that is, if we add, let's say, food, let's add cycling, let's add, maybe what we can also add is Home Alone, as that is something that I expect that would not have that stable trend, as it's a movie that's popular once a year or something like that, close to that. Let's also add delivery, because that's probably more popular today, and let's add wine, and let's add beer. So these are all the keywords, and as you can see, there are more than 5. So we will see later on how we can actually see the trend for all of them. So just to show you that the 5 terms in a list is a limit if you're accessing all 5 at once, but one by one it's completely fine. So we have more than 5 words. Now let's see what else we need. We need to cover 3 more. Category is fine. So we have geo, which is of course the part that you're interested in. So worldwide, if it's worldwide, it's by default, and that one is specifying nothing, so leaving geo to be equal to empty. I'll stick with this for now, so that's completely fine. If you want to select a particular country and maybe you don't know the code, the easiest way, if you have only one country, is select the country from the list. Let's say Australia, and here you would see geo is equal to AU. So that's what you would have here, for example, if you're interested in Australia. And you can also have US and then the state, so that's also possible. So you can narrow your search to a given part of the planet Earth, let me put it that way. So this one we've covered. Now we need to have more information on time frame and on this gprop. Time zone, this is something that we've mentioned briefly. Time frame, if you see here, there are various options. So we can get data on hourly level, we can get on, I think it's probably on daily level, we have some more, but these longer frames are probably on, so this one is also, you get a data point for every day, but if you check 12 months or more, you'll see that it's weekly. So it's between starting and ending of the week. So what makes sense? Well, what are the time frames that we would want to use? For me personally, what I prefer to use is 5 years to figure out is there a trend. And here we can slice and dice, as they say, more of the data. So I'll select this one, but we might also later on want to find more information about the last 12 months, maybe 90 or 30 days, depends on what our purpose is. Now for this purpose, for particular this tutorial, I'll leave the time frame to as it is. But what you can also do is you can have time frames equal and then a list. So maybe today 5 years, then today 12 months, then today 3 months, and let's say today 1 month. And then down here you would have to change this to time frames 0, and this would be exactly the same. So you need to find what works best for you, but make sure that it's easily adjustable. Or maybe you can have here a time frame to be equal to time frames 0, and then here you have time frame. So you know what is the choice that you have. So you can have here all of the possible time frames, and then here you would just choose the one that works best for you. Or maybe you would have time frames equals as 1 and then comment all the other ones. It's really up to you. Let's stick with this one for now. And the last part, so actually let's focus a bit more on the time frame. So we have the years, the months, we can do that. Here you can find all information about the time frames that you can use. So you can use specific dates, and as you can see, that's referring to this custom range. So from to, you can use daily, you can use hourly, and it's really quite flexible. And you have to know that sometimes there are some limitations. For example, here it says seems to only work for 7 days only. But if you take a look at the options that you have on Google Trends website, it's indeed between 1 and 7 days. So that makes sense. I'll go back to worldwide, so we can sometimes maybe compare later on. But let's focus on the other parts and let's start getting some data back. So gprop would be the last part, the last parameter that we can specify. I'll leave it as empty. That the default is actually related to web searches. I'm focused on that, but as you can see, it can be images, news, YouTube, or Frugal. That's actually for Google shopping results. So it's really depending on what your purpose is. So here, maybe if you're writing this code for someone else, you might want to add a comment of the various options that it may be, or maybe refer to the documentation to the point where the person can find more information. But keep in mind that person might be you in a few years, where you have no clue what the code was related to, and you need to remind yourself on that. All right. So now, how are we going to run this to find the interest over time? So here it's mentioned pytrends.interest over time. Let's store that into data. But now keep in mind that our list at the moment is all keywords. So if I'm to use this one, well, let's see what happens. Take a look at this. The request failed. Google returned a response with code 400. Now, if you get this error, it means that something is wrong, probably in this part here. Now, we know that there is a limitation of using Google Trends passing a list of more than 5 elements. That's what's causing the issue, most likely. Let's do this. Let's remove part of this for now. And let's see if this would return an error or not. Look at that. Now this looks to be working, so we know that, okay, the issue was that we had more. Now, we're going to go back because we want to make sure that it works with more than 5 keywords. But how are we going to do that? Well, one way is to create a so-called temporary list. Let's have a temporary list being keywords, which is an empty one, right? So this is a list that has absolutely no elements in it yet. And this part here, which is accessing the data, well, let's have that as a function called check trends. So this would be the part that when run, it's going to check whether there's a trend. And of course, that's the part that we're going to code in the next part of this tutorial. So what we can do is this temporary list we can use to add every keyword one by one. So let's do this. For every keyword that we have, so KW in all keywords, first we're going to append it to our keywords list. Right, so keywords, we're going to append our keyword. Then we're going to check trends. Now, when we're checking trends, we're not going to pass all keywords, but only keywords. And what this is, well, just this one keyword that was in the list. Once we're done with it, keywords.pop. So we're going to remove that element from the list, and the list is again empty. We can go to the second iteration and add, for example, food. Right? So if we do this, that would be quite good. Now, we have our data, and if you take a look at what data is, so maybe what we can do is, let's take a look at data. I'm going to print it, but I'm not going to use the 5 years. Never mind. Let's start with this. Let's see how this looks like. So it will run with all but here. So as you can see, for all of these, we have the date. So starting date, 5 years ago, ending date. We can see that based on the delta between the dates, it's weekly data. We can see, for example, for fidget spinner that there was no interest because the product did not exist back then. And we can also see that there's a column is partial, which basically depends, is the data final or maybe there's something missing at the moment. So as you can see, it's for a lot of these the case, maybe it's even for all, but the structure is more or less the same. So we have date, we have the keyword, and we have is partial, true or false. This is partial, we're not going to focus on that. I don't think it would add a lot of information unless you see true more than once at the end, but you see it somewhere in between as well. Now, how would we determine if there's a trend or not? Let's do this. Let's try to calculate the mean. And I think that would be a good starting point. So mean would be equal to data.mean. And let's round this by 2. And what we're going to do is we're going to print mean, but then we're going to specify KW, because don't forget, this is our keyword. So what we would have is, so let's do this, keyword plus string of the mean, and let's add like this. So we would have, for example, fidget spinner, right? That's the first one, semicolon, string, and then let's see how this looks like. So 4, 85, 35, 14, and so on. Now, what does this mean? How can you read this information? Well, if the mean is a low number, it means that on average it was very low, right? But don't forget that there is also a point when it was 100. So this means that it is not very stable over time. Comparing it to food, as you can see, the mean is 85. So we do have 100, but all the mean, the average movement is not that far from the 100. So just keep that in mind on how do you read that. Cycling 35, so somewhere in between. We have Home Alone at 14, so this is fairly low, but don't forget there are peaks probably at the end of the year and so on. Delivery 33, wine and beer. Beer seems to be much more stable. So this is one thing that we can use to make conclusion, is this trend stable over time or not? Of course, is that enough? It's not enough. So what we need to do is, let's calculate the following. So let's take a look at the average. I'm not going to print this one for now, but we're going to print it later on. So what is the average interest or the mean interest for the last year? Well, let's take a look at data, KW, so the keyword. And if we want to get the last year, what we would do is we would have minus 52 to the end. 52 weeks, we have weekly data till the end, dot mean. And we're going to round it to 2 decimals. So if we know what is the average for the entire period, what is the average for the last period, we can already have some comparison. So let's store that as trend. So trend would be equal to, let's do it like this. Trend, average divided by mean, but not any mean, the mean of our keyword, because don't forget, mean has also this. If we do this only by mean, I think we would have some data type, but there's no need to do that. So we're going to subtract 1 first, and then we're also going to multiply it by 100. And this is something that we're going to round to 2 decimals. All right, now this should provide us some information on the interest in the last year compared to the interest in the last 5 years. Let's do that. Let's start with that. Print. I'm going to make this wider. I don't think we're going to need this part, but anyway, let's leave it there. So what we're going to print is what this trend suggests is the average year compared to the last 5 years. And we also have the mean, which is the average interest in the last 5 years. So let's actually have both. So the average 5 years interest of the keyword was plus string of mean keyword, and the last year interest of the keyword, whatever the keyword is, compared to the last 5 years has, maybe we can do it like this, has changed by, it has changed by a string trend percentage. Compared to the last 5 years, changed by plus, that should work. All right, I see something popping on my other screen. Let me put it here. So last year average 422, we know that's quite low, but we can also see that last year compared to 5 years, up here I'm missing space. So in this point we need to also test and make sure that it looks good. Maybe also here as well. So those two we need to add here and here. Here we might also add a dot if we want to. If not, it's really up to you. But let's make sure that it's so mean plus dot. There we go. You should be able to see that on the screen. Good. So we have some information on the trend and the average interest, and based on that we can calculate, is this interest stable over time? Is this interest maybe declining? Is it increasing? Is it new product or service or whatever it is we're searching for? So one more thing that we need to have in mind before we make this decision is to calculate the average, but for the first year. So if we take last year versus 5 years ago, then we should get some more insights into the data. And let's calculate the same thing as we did here with the trend, except it would be trend 2, and it would be average divided by average 2. So now this trend, what it does is it compares what is the interest last year, what was it 5 years ago. So that would be something that we will take a look at. So there are 3 data points that we have. First, mean. What was the average interest in the last 5 years? Then, second, how does that compare with the interest of last year? And third, how does the last year interest compare to the interest 5 years ago? And now, with all this data, we can make some nice conclusions. And let's start with what are the possible scenarios? Well, we might have a stable trend, which means that the mean was quite high. So we have quite a stable trend. We might have some seasonal movements. We might have some cyclical movements. So let's start with that. So the first thing that I want to do is let's have stable trend. So if mean of our keyword is greater than, let's say 75, then, and let's also add if the trend is greater or lower or equal than 5. So if we have absolute change of last year compared to the years before that's lower than 5%, then let's say that the interest for our keyword, whatever it is stable in the last 5 years. So if that is the case, it's quite clear, really high, not a lot of volatility, so it's stable. And comparing the last year versus the last 5 years, not that high trend, so it's stable, but not really increasing or decreasing. All right, now what else might happen is, well, if this is the case, right? So if we still have a high mean, but the trend is lower, let's start with greater, so greater than 5. So it is still stable, but we also see a slight increase. So maybe that's something that we would like to have. So interest is stable and increasing in the last 5 years. Now, you already know, well, if this was increasing, right? If we take this and we have the same, but having a trend of lower than -5%, well, we can say that it's decreasing. It's stable and decreasing. So stable meaning that it didn't change a lot, but it is slightly decreased. So maybe you would like to add the word slightly increasing. It's really up to you. Now, what else are there? Well, we can say that it's not really stable, but it's let's say close to stable, relatively stable. Now we're going to continue this if or elif loop, and we're going to add some more combinations. So if we have, let's say the interest is 60, and then we have the absolute trend being lower than, let's say 15, so 15%. I think for these high means, you cannot expect high trends, but for lower means you can expect. So maybe here you would think, all right, I think the 10% change can be considered as a huge change. Sure, it's really up to you. There's not many rules. You are making the rules at this stage. But let's say that this was, so we had quite high interest, not very high, but still quite high. And then there was not a lot of change. So we can say that the interest, so what we had here, right? So we can have more or less the same, we can say relatively stable. So not that high increase or high decrease. Don't forget, we're comparing 1 year to the average of 5 years. Now, if we take the next part, you can already see how it's evolving. So we have 60 and the trend is greater than 15. This one should be lower or equal to 15. So if it's greater than 15, then what we would say is the interest for our keyword is, we can say, relatively stable and increasing in the last 5 years. So this is really something that's up to you to define and to see how would I like this to sound. So if we do the same for the other side, so having the trend lower than minus 15%, you can say that it's decreasing in the last 5 years. I think it's quite logical, but if you have any issues with this, understanding it, or have some additional questions, or you might suggest why are we using 60 or why are we using this trend and 15 or whatever it is, just feel free to let me know in the comment section below. Now, what I think is more interesting is when we have some more of a seasonal movements. Hopefully we will be able to identify them. We have a keyword that should be more cyclical, like cycling. At least that's my expectation, but let's see how that goes. We continue with elif. Now, what would be your definition of cyclical? Maybe you would say, well, if it's over 30, I would go with 20, and I would say if the trend is lower than 15. So keep in mind that this seasonal might also be an indication of a new product. So this would be a definition of cyclical. It means that although the average is low, there's not much trend. So it is low, but we have some spikes. But if you take a look at the next year, comparing the trend, it's more or less comparable. The change is not that significant. So we can say that the interest for the keyword is seasonal. Right, so it is low, but yeah, it is what it is. It's not that it's a new product, it's just always like that. Then we can have new product, which might be, let's say, the same one. So what a new product would be? Well, we do have a low mean, right? Because at one point it pops up, but the trend is greater than, let's say, 15. So we have a high trend. Last year was really high compared to the average. The mean was quite low. So, or maybe here you would say, yeah, 15 is too low. Maybe let's go with 30. Sure. So we can say that this one is trending, or we can say new or trending. It's really something that we can work on and decide. Now, what if it's the other way? If it's low, but the trend is quite low. If it has a negative trend, well, we can say that declining. I would say keyword. I would not say actually product, because it doesn't have to be product, or just declining. So if the trend is lower than minus 15, so year over the last 5 years, it has decreased by 15, then we can say that is significantly decreasing. And this is something that's up to you again to define and to see what makes sense, what doesn't. Let's focus on, let's actually do one more. I'm not sure if this one I would define actually as new. I would probably say it's trending. Might not be new, because 20 is still quite high for quite large period. Maybe trending, so, and maybe new, I would leave this to be 0. So cyclical means that, let's say that it's really low, so 5, and the absolute trend is lower or equal than 15. So something that we had here, seasonal, now it's cyclical. Now maybe you only want to differentiate the keywords into 2 groups, and you don't have to do all this matching. Maybe you would only want to find those that have mean of over 50. Sure, if that works for you, go for it. Now let's do 1 or 2 more. New, let's copy this again. Well, a new would be that if it's 0 but the trend is greater Let me see, did we cover everything? So this is absolute lower. All right, that looks quite okay. So we did cover the scenarios. Here we have if it's greater, if it's lower, so we don't have. Cool. All right, looks good. Now this one I would say is new and trending. So we have a new product and trending. Let's have a completely declining one. What that means is this is, although this is very low, so it's probably below 5, the trend is lower than -15. So it's really decreasing. So we can say is declining or decreasing and not comparable to its peak, because it had a peak, doesn't have it anymore. Now, is there something that we have missed? Maybe. So for that reason, we're going to do the following. We're going to add just other, which would be else. And here we can have this is something to be checked. So whatever we have not covered, check it. Maybe we need to adjust some of the matchings up here, and yeah, it's something that we have not done yet. Now I'm going to run this. Oh, I see it on my other screen. Let's see what the outcome of this would be. Maybe there's a lot to add, but maybe before that, let's add an empty row. There we go. Just so we can see where the first keyword stops and where the second one ends. So let me run this and let's see how far we get. All right, so average 5-year interest of fidget spinner was 4.25. We know it's very low. If you take a look at our explanation, last year has changed by -90% compared to the last 5 years. It's declining and not comparable to its peak. Something that we expected, we already know. Food, stable, increasing in the last 5 years by 10%. Cycling, so not a huge change. That's why we say that it is also, and also it's seasonal. So this makes sense because it really depends on the season. We see that Home Alone as a movie is cyclical, so it has low mean, but you see that it doesn't really grow year on year. So it is fine that it has low mean over time. Then we have delivery. We have that one as trending. So it's not new, right? It's not new, but it's trending, which makes sense. If we take a look into the situation with COVID-19, it's very plausible. Then we have wine, relatively stable, and beer, stable. So this one beer has higher interest over time. It's more stable, not higher, but more stable interest over time. I think this is quite good. So we have more than 5 keywords just by pressing a button. We have some nice outcome on that. But there's one more thing that we need to cover, and that's the comparison of last year interest with 5 years ago. So let's add here a comment. Comparison last year versus 5 years ago. That is something that we already have. So we've calculated the average to being average of 5 years ago. So maybe we can say yearly average, and this would be last year average. So you can it's always good to add comments. Trend to, this is the division between the two, and that's what we're looking for. Now, one thing that might be the case is average to might be 0. There might be no average coming from 5 years ago because the product or whatever we were searching for didn't exist back then. So let's start with that. If average 2 is equal to 0, then you can say this didn't exist 5 years ago. So there we go. Elif. Now let's focus on trend 2, which is comparing this year versus 5 years ago. If this one was greater than 15, then we can say that the last year interest is quite higher or significantly higher compared to 5 years ago. And then we can also add plus, let's do it like this. It has changed, or it has increased by string of trend2 plus %. Now, you already know, if we have this once, we can just copy the same. Now it would be if it's below 15. And here we can say that last year interest is quite lower. It has decreased by, now keep in mind that here, if you keep it as it is, it would be minus 20%. If you want to have it has increased by 20%, you can always make this an absolute value. I'll leave it as it is. I like that presentation better, but it's really up to you. And then the last part is if last year compared to 5 years ago, it's not, the change is not greater than 15%, we can say that the last year interest is comparable to 5 years ago. And then this part we can use, right? It has changed by, but we can do the following. It has changed by that. It has changed by. There we go. That should work good. Let's take a look at the outcome of this. So the first three we already saw. There's not much that has changed there. So there's nothing that's changed there. Last year interest compared to 5 years ago increased, so quite higher. Cycling lower, decreased by. This one doesn't make sense yet, right? Because if it's 0.35, it's not quite lower. And the reason for that is that here we need to add if it's lower than minus 15 and not lower than 15. So this is basically the testing part of our code, just to make sure that we did not miss anything. Now, let's see what we have about cycling. Comparable, changed by 0.35. We can also add here by only if we want to, but it's completely fine. So cyclical, comparable for home alone. Delivery, quite higher, quite expected as well. Comparable for both beer and wine. This would be all regarding this tutorial. I'm going to include a link to the library in the description, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next video. Well, I think that sentence is not really correct, although it's being used a lot. I'm not seeing you, but I hope that you will be seeing me in the next video. In case of any questions or comments, please let me know in the comment section below. Take care. Bye-bye.